Alright, in this video I'm going to show you guys a brief rundown of how the Hypershade window works. And so this is going to be a way that we can view different nodes, in this case particularly for shaders and materials, and connect them together to create more complex setups than just plugging maps straight into our shader in the attribute editor. Right? So when we get in here, whenever we attach a texture map, usually we're either adjusting the values directly here, or we are plugging in a texture map to get some variation. It doesn't have to necessarily be a texture map. It can also be a node within RenderMan or Maya to modify or adjust that attribute without an image from the outside. So when I click on this, I usually get a node that I can create. And so if I come back into that Hypershade window, look here, here's just a setup I have right here for this object right there. And so I'm actually just plugging in a single texture map into the specular roughness. So you can see it is plugging a texture image right here, and it is going through a different node and then plugging into the specular roughness to modify that attribute. And so when we get more complicated setups, let's go ahead and show you one of those really quickly. It can start to look a little bit like this, where we are getting multiple inputs going in, and it can get a little complicated and confusing. In my opinion, the Hypershade doesn't necessarily have the best layout structure for working with nodes, but that's just me. Let me show you another example. Here's another example. In this case, we're not plugging everything into one single input or node. We actually have other nodes that are also taking multiple inputs. So you can see they're kind of like chaining between them, and really it's a case-by-case situation. And a lot of these nodes are structured in a way that it's once you get used to this layout and what these nodes look like, it can be pretty intuitive in terms of like what a node is expecting and what a node's going to be plugging into. And then it becomes a matter of creativity on your part for how you utilize nodes to daisy chain into one node and daisy chain into another node to get some more complicated or interesting effects. So let's step back a second and talk about this window and how we can start working within our node graph. So this is what the Hypershade looks like. Up here we have the browser window, which is going to list all of our materials, all of our texture nodes, and any other types of nodes that we have in our scene. Pretty much everything can be represented as a node, and then the Hypershade's only displaying certain objects as a node. There's also the node editor, which is going to be showing different things like objects as nodes, and if you're using rigging, you might use that node editor a lot to use utility nodes to set up more complicated rig systems. But here we're just worrying about materials, textures, and utilities. Most of the time, just materials. So in the browser, what we do is we can locate what our material we're using is. So whenever I create a material in here, where I right click and say assign new material, it's going to pop up inside of that Hypershade window. And so let's say I'm going to work on, let's just start from a new one. So I'll select this, assign new material, and we'll go to RenderMan BXDF and then go fix our surface. Okay. And you'll see if you have a blank, or actually if you have any workspace open in the Hypershade editor, it will automatically be added to it. We can also add that create menu that pops up whenever I right click and say create new, is also over here, including all the other types of nodes that aren't necessarily materials. So if I could go the same thing, RenderMan BXDF, find that Pixar surface. We can add new nodes. So let's say I wanted it to load in a texture file. So using RenderMan's Pixar texture. So I'm going to go to pattern, and I'm going to go to Pixar texture, and then adds it right there. Or another thing I could do, if I want to delete the node, I can just press backspace or delete. And I'll talk about that in a second. Another way we can find and add nodes is if we know the name of the node, you can press tab on your keyboard and then start typing in the name of it. So I can do texture. So you can see there's a lot of them with texture in it. I'm going to use Pixar texture. Be careful of Pixar P texture. That trips people up sometimes. So it's just a texture node. It's going to load in a texture image. So that's two different ways that we can add from the create menu. And on the right-hand side, we have our property editor, which is essentially like our attribute editor. So this look and layout is going to be the same thing as our attribute editor. It just is only focusing on the material aspect or whatever node you have selected and not worrying about any of the other objects attributes. And finally, in the middle, we've already kind of And in the middle, you can kind of already guess from how we've been working with this so far, is our graph editor or our workspace. And so this is where we're going to be actually plugging in a lot of our nodes and attaching them to one another. So first I'm going to show you guys how to add stuff to it. So we already saw that when I created a new material, and this happens whenever you add new lights or cameras or rendering nodes, they'll just automatically populate in here. And if I want to remove them, if I press delete, it's actually going to delete it from the scene. So you'll see this Pixar Surface 19, which is right here. If I come in here and press delete, it actually deletes it from my scene. So if you don't want to do that and you just want to remove it from your current graph, you can come up here. And so up here we have a bunch of different ways of adding and removing nodes from our graph. So if I press this one right here, I can remove that selected node. And if I select that node and then click on this little plus sign, it will add that node. If I click on this button right here, it's going to clear the entire graph. Let's go ahead and add that back in. Over here is going to be adding multiple nodes, and this is probably easier to show on something like, let's look at this one. To already have multiple nodes connected to each other, right? And so if I go ahead and clear that graph, I'm making sure I have selected Pixar Surface 18. I'm going to clear that graph. And then if I just added one node, that's fine, but I don't want to have to go in and find each one of those nodes and click add, click add, click add. That'd be really tedious. So we have these input and output buttons. So if I click on the input button, what's going to do is it's going to add all of the connected inputs to my currently selected node. So if I went ahead and I actually remove these two, I'm not deleting them, I'm just removing them from being viewable. They're still actually connected. So if I come in here, you can see this little black icon with the square and that little input arrow. That means there's an incoming connection to that attribute. And so it's coming into the input color right here. We just can't see it. So if I go ahead and click on that input, it's going to grab all those inputs that are connected to it. And it's also hiding the rest of it. So that can be a little confusing sometimes too. If I wanted to see all of them, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and select both of these. I'm going to clear my graph. Just going to add those two. And if I wanted to bring in those inputs but keep this Pixar surface, I would just make sure both of these are selected and just grab their inputs. If I wanted to grab just the outputs, so for instance, if I had this node and I wanted to see everything else connected to it, so let's first clear and add it back in. I'll just click on this outputs, and so it's going to go through that all the way through that chain. And then finally what I could do is I can grab both directions at the same time. Let's go ahead and clear it. I'm going to add that back in, and I want the inputs and the outputs at the same time. Generally speaking, when I'm usually working on this, you usually just grab the material and click on inputs, outputs, and it's going to hook up everything correctly. You'll notice when I grab this one, click inputs, outputs, this blue node, which is called the shading group, and it's kind of an organizational node for your shader and some other aspects of your shader and how it is associated with the scene. So you have your shader, which is your material, in this case Pixar surface, and then you have your shading group, and every shader needs its shading group to be associated with objects, and also it's associated with other nodes too. But anyways, for some reason when you click on the input output, they don't automatically connect, even though this is technically connected. But if you click on the material, click input output, it will automatically connect for you. This button right here, it can be used to organize your nodes. And so if you have a really messy node structure, so I'm just going to try to find something that like this one. It's not messy, it's actually pretty fine. And I lay it out very purposefully, but let's say I had all these nodes kind of mixed everywhere, and there was not a huge amount of rhyme or reason to it. If I select that button right there, it's going to relay them out in a more or less grid-like pattern and try to orient these nodes based on how they're collapsed. You'll see they're all kind of different sizes, and we'll talk about that next, which is like the visibility of the inputs and outputs. But if they're all collapsed down and I clicked on that, you'd get like a really neat and organized kind of layout. But the problem is, let's go back out to like the input output connections. The problem is sometimes like these start to cross streams, right? So you see a node crossing streams. And in this case, it's not a big deal, but when you have a really large node structure, that can be kind of confusing. Like it might put something like this node right here and this node right up here. And it might get a little challenging. So in all honesty, I don't use this button that much. Maybe I'll do it if I drop in like a new node graph and I just want to kind of get a quick organization and then resort things. But especially in this layout in the Hypershade, it's not always incredibly intuitive like how it's laid out, and it takes some mental kind of wrapping your head around of like, okay, this area I'm trying to do this, and I'm taking that output of this kind of mixing and I'm plugging it into here. So I don't always use this because it can mess up that organization you might give to yourself. So I might be like, okay, this is all associated with this is the displacement shader up here. I'm gonna grab all the displacement stuff and make sure it's up here out of the way so I'm not super confused. And then this is gonna be the normal map, this is gonna be the diffuse, and this is gonna be the specular roughness, right? And so you start to organize it based on how you, what makes sense and what's logical to you. That organizational feature can really mess that up. I didn't cover this yet, but simple navigation here it's a lot like Maya, right? You can zoom with your mouse, and I think you can hold Alt and right click and drag if you don't have a mouse wheel. You can hold Alt and middle mouse click and drag to pan. You just do middle mouse click and pan. There's probably a way to pan without a middle mouse button, but I actually don't really know what it is. You can click and drag to select, and you can just click and drag on selected nodes to move them. So it's pretty straightforward. Before I move on to connecting our nodes together, let's mention a few more things. First, up here we have the collapsing. We'll talk about that in a second once we talk about inputting and outputting. And yeah, actually all these are associated with the node input outputs and the display of it, so we'll talk about that in a second. Here we can have a grid. Not super necessary all the time, but if you like that look, you can. It might be more helpful if you're using snapping to grid, so you can actually have your nodes snap to the grid. Personally, I just like it being freeform, but it's totally up to you. It's whatever you want to do. We have tabs here. So this is where if you have especially once you do a lot of shading work and you have a scene where you have multiple materials and they're all kind of getting a little complicated in everyone's setups, you often want to save that setup. So if in this case, I have like my wood material, and so I have its node structure and set up here. And here I have my metal material. And so it's a good idea to, if you're going to work on a new one, just add a new tab, give it a name by double clicking and typing, and then go ahead and start dropping your nodes in. And Maya will save this node structure and these tabs for you. So it's really handy to save your work and not have to redo a lot of stuff. Oh, and I should have mentioned this before, but if you, this button right here is going to create a node graph structure for you based on the object you select. So if you come in here and I grab that object and I come back in here, just create a new tab and click the input out, or sorry, not that button. If I click on the graph button right here, it says graph materials on selected objects. It's going to grab that material and its inputs and outputs and go ahead and lay out the graph for me, which is really handy. Okay, so back to connecting our nodes together within our graph editor. So something to keep in mind if you're not familiar or have worked very much with a node editor is that we have this logic structure where we have data coming from the top of the chain or the river or the tree, whatever you want to call it, and going down to the bottom. And so this is the input to the output structure. You can see these little arrows pointing in the direction that data is flowing. So the idea is we have some kind of top node, and this top node is the start of our data. So it's either representing a value that's created by that node. In this case, I'm loading in a texture map, or it might be something like a, let's see, I think I have one of these set up already. Actually, I don't think I do. Okay, or I could be taking in something in a node inside of Maya, like Pixar Fractal. I guess this is technically in RenderMan, but this is actually being created by RenderMan, and this is the start of my data. I can still add inputs to this, but this can be the start of my chain of input or data. And so it takes a value, it goes to the next node, and that next node does a transformation to it, right? It either like modifies that number or that collection of numbers, and then it feeds it into the next node, which does another modification to that. You can kind of think of it as like this is like a variable, right? And that variable flows through and goes into a new function. That function does something to that variable, like adds or subtracts or multiplies to it, and then that new transform variable flows onto the next one. And so we have this chain or river structure where each of these links is making a modification until it reaches the end of our chain. In this case, we don't really usually think about designing it in terms of, starting with a input value and then tweaking it, at least not in this case with materials. You might in like Substance Designer or some other program. But in here, we're mostly thinking about this material as like our bedrock or our kind of base. And even though the shading group is technically the very end of our output, we're really thinking about everything in relation to this. So we usually start with that material. So we have multiple types of little dots here. And the dots, let's go ahead and bring in a different node. I'll just bring that Pixar texture back in. Texture. Okay. And so on the left-hand side, we're going to have inputs. So this is data that can come into this node to be modified. And then we have outputs on the right-hand side, which is data exiting out of this that have been modified by this node. And it's going to carry on and continue to the next node. So in this case, we are loading in a texture map with this node right here. The different colors of these dots represents what type of data it is. We're not going to really worry about blue. It's kind of like an edge case, and to be completely honest, I'm not sure what blue is representing. I know the nodes that are associated with it, but I don't know what the catch-all is for it. But generally speaking, we're worried mostly about the red and green ones. Red is going to be for color. So red is going to be a collection of 3 separate values. And then green is going to be a single float value. So let's say in this case, it's the red pixel value. And let's say the red pixel value is 125. If I grab this, now I'm taking that value of 125 from that pixel location and I'm plugging it into the next node. The color, you can see, is made up of 3 separate float values, or these green nodes, which are single numbers. So a color is, red, green, and blue. So it's made up of red, green, and blue pixels. And so it's going to have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. When we talk about colors, a lot of times we'll call them channels too. So it could be the input or output, but it also be a channel. If you hear me say like grab the red channel, I mean grab the red input or red output from that node. So that's what's handy about this though is I can go ahead and grab all 3 of those values at the same time and plug it into an input that's expecting those red, green, and blue values. So I can come over here to the diffuse color, and let's say this is going to be my color map, and I can either grab the color RGB from this texture map and plug it into the diffuse, or I can come over here and plug the red channel into the diffuse red, the green channel into the diffuse green, and then the blue channel into the diffuse blue. Connecting is pretty easy. You can do it many different ways. So the easiest way to do it inside the Hypershade here is to go ahead and just click and drag on that node and then plug it into the corresponding node. And then Maya has this really handy feature where it won't let you plug in data that's incorrect for that input node. So if I grab this actually contains 3 separate values. I couldn't plug those 3 separate values into an input that's expecting a single input. So all those greens are grayed out, I guess, because it doesn't want you to try to plug in 3 values into a single input. But this input right here, these red ones are expecting 3 values coming in. So I can plug into any of those. So it's really handy. But you also notice the red doesn't always mean, or red isn't the only 3 value output or input. You can also notice that some of these, like this is expecting like vector information or XYZ information or directional information. And so even though it's also 3 values, and they could be really, this data can be exactly the same, they're just kind of named differently here. And so again, I can plug that into those reds, but I can also plug into this green down here. So that red and green doesn't always necessarily mean that, if you're grabbing a green value, it's only going to be a single float value. So you have to keep that in mind. But you can see with these little plus and minus signs here, we can see that there's multiple values packed in here. So we can just plug in attach. So I'm just going to attach these values here. If I want to disconnect, I can click and drag the endpoint and then plug it into a new one. So let's say I accidentally plugged into the wrong one. Oops, I plugged in the green. I'm gonna click it, drag it to red. Or let's say I had this plugged in the green and I'm like, oh, plugging the red into the green. I actually want to plug the green into the green. Just click and drag, pretty easy. If you want to get rid of your selection, you can either click or you just and click and drag. If you select off into nothing, it'll delete it. So I just click and drag off like that. Or if let's say I have a bunch of these, you could always use delete. So you can either select it and press delete, or you just like click and drag and delete them. Pretty easy. You can also view what those inputs and what that input is connecting to, or which output is connected to which input, is by clicking this window and just hovering over it. You can see it says the result R, so the red color from my Pixar texture node, is plugging into the red channel of my diffuse color. So that's really handy when it doesn't show your input or output here, or let's say it's like collapsed in a way that you can see there's an output coming here into the input, but I don't know what it is. I can click and hover over that. That's really handy. And I just did something there that I haven't shown you guys yet. Don't worry about it just now. But yeah, so if I had 3 of those values, and you can see that layout got a little confusing. Let's go back to selecting these. There we go. Let's go ahead and you can see they're crisscrossed. I don't really know why I did that. That's weird. Okay, but let's say again here I'm collapsed. I can hover over that. You can see now it's yellow, which just means this is representing multiple inputs and outputs. And you can see if I hover it, it's going to show me a list of those. Okay, this is a good time to talk about the visibility, and I'll show you how to, actually let's go ahead and show you guys how to connect things first. So I already showed you guys one way of connecting nodes, and so that's just by grabbing those inputs and outputs. Let's see if I can refresh that so they can get back into order. Okay, cool. So we can just click and drag, like I can drag the diffuse color here. Another thing you can do is you can actually drag the node itself into the attribute. So let's say I want to attach this Pixar texture to the diffuse color, right? So I can go in here and try to find diffuse color. Sometimes that's kind of annoying and that's kind of hard. So what you can do is you can middle mouse click and drag on that node, and you can drop it on that diffuse color. And usually what Maya is going to do is it's going to try to understand what you mean by that. It's going to be like, oh, okay, you want to connect this Pixar texture to the Pixar surface diffuse color. You probably want the color output, the result RGB. It doesn't always do it correctly. There might be something else you want. In that case, you probably need to find that input and output. But also what's handy is if that texture input, if that input or output isn't showing by default, you sometimes have to actually grab through this. So this right here is going to list all possible choices. So it gets kind of annoying doing this. So you probably don't want to do it if you can help it. Like for instance, I'm going to click on this one. You can see there's tons of potential inputs, and not all of them show up on the node itself. Even though the Pixar surface node can be really long if you try to show all the nodes. So you could always drag that node. So let's say I'm going to take the results color, or let's just connect that first, because if it's occupied, for some reason it doesn't like to show it. So I'll take that result RGB, and there we go, result RGB, and I can click on here, and I want to put that into the diffuse color, and it'll connect it for me. But generally speaking, I think just plugging them straight from the output to the input, or like I said, dragging the node straight onto the color, like if I want to also make this the specular color, is really one of the most easy ways to do that. But especially on something like if I want to add a manifold, so talk about this later, but in texturing, but a manifold will be a way that you can modify like texture coordinates. So you're using your texture and how it maps onto your object. So in this case, a manifold 2D is going to take like a 2D texture, and it's going to like stretch and scale it, and you can do all kinds of other things to that texture and how it tiles on the object. So in this case, I want to attach it to my Pixar texture, right? And let's plug that back into diffuse color. But it's not always obvious, like, oh, I know Pixar manifold attaches Pixar texture, I just don't know where it goes. So in this case, if you know it's going to be coming into the manifold, so you can see here it's manifold, I can just click and drag that onto manifold, and oh, the result goes into the manifold. There we go. So it's pretty useful in a lot of cases. Okay, and finally, let's go ahead and talk about the visibility selection. So this is really helpful for your nodes and just organizing. Once you get used to it, it makes things really easy. And so these are these buttons right here, and they're also mapped to the 1, 2, and 3, and I think the 4 also. 4, I can't remember what 4, I think 4 is default. So anyways, it's 1 is going to be fully collapsed. 2 is going to be showing, there's certain inputs and outputs it'll always show, like the message, but it's essentially only going to show you the inputs and outputs that are actually currently connected to others. And then 3 is going to try to uncollapse all of them and show you all possibilities. And some nodes, like the Pixar surface node, which is really robust, also has like an insane amount of inputs and outputs possible. So we usually don't want to do that on that node. But a lot of these nodes that are shorter, 3 is very often like what you want, because it might like this, be like this, and I want to, let's go ahead and I'll unconnect that, and I press, well, I guess for the Pixar texture, it's, there you go. And I want that color output, that's kind of annoying, so I'd press 3. Or I could press 4 and get that default layout, because sometimes that default layout's really handy, especially on the, that's the name. Press 4 on that keyboard, it's going to have that default layout. It's going to show me most of the most common used nodes. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just going to be, let's see, I think this one right here is going to set to default. Yeah, okay, so this is the default one. Show from custom attribute, whatever. Okay, this right here is going to be a naming search feature. So if you have something like this, right? This is just going to disable or enable on that node the ability to search. So if I wanted, like, let's say I'm looking for the shading tangent, so I might type in tangent. So I guess it's not showing up by default. So I'd probably have to find it in that node input. Let's find something that is actually listed here. So let's look at iridescence. So I can come up here and type in irid, and then I have all my iridescence. So if you do have that really long input, you could do that. That shading tangent must be packed into the inputs here. So we can probably find that somewhere in here. Shading tangents, and it might be in other, I hope not. It might be named differently. So that could be something that can be a little confusing, is that, for one, what's also kind of annoying and confusing is for some reason at a certain point it decides not to be alphabetical. So that can make finding them a little hard. But specular shading tangent. Yeah, so I'll have to find it. Actually, this is something I shouldn't have brought up, but some of these names have names that are a little less cleaned up and friendly. Let me find that. This is just purely for me, not for you guys. Okay, here it is. So this value right here, shading tangent, is called specular anisotropy direction. And a handy way you can also find that out is just click in here and just hover over it. At the bottom, you can see it says there, specular anisotropy direction, and it's also telling you what the expected input is. So if you do know where it is inside your materials attribute editor or property editor, you can come in here and just highlight over it and find out what the node name of it is if you really need to find it. And finally, for the third way that we can add, we've already seen this, and it's one that you guys are probably used to, but it is using the little checker board right here. And so sometimes, like that's actually what I did with this shading tangent, is I didn't think to look at that name and try to find it here. I just figured, you know, it's easier just click on this, find the node that I'm going to want, which is the tangent fields, Pixar tangent fields, and then I can just go find that value right there. And so it's already connected for me. And because it has that little box with that black arrow on it, I know that that means there's an incoming connection. So we can just disconnect there if we want to get rid of it. Remember, if you press delete, it's going to delete the node. If you press minus, it's going to keep the node, just remove it from the graph editor, but not mess with the connections at all. And if I go ahead and disconnect the node here, now I can add a new input to it. Or I can also, if I'm not in the Hypershade editor, you can always right click on this and say break connection, and it will disconnect it for you too. So the last thing, I keep saying finally, but the last thing I want to actually talk about is show you guys, let's set this all to 1. Let's do inputs, outputs, there we go. All right, last thing I want to show you guys is kind of a recommended layout. So generally speaking, I usually don't have this browser window open because usually a lot of times I'll actually grab the object that has the material and then add it in here and just have a separate tab. But you'll occasionally want to bring up that browser window. So you click on that and then just grab it, add input, output, and then close this window again. Because screen space, especially when you're looking at your renders and you're also looking at your Maya scene, and then you're also looking at this Hypershade, visual real estate gets really hard, especially if you don't have 2 monitors. And I recommend 2 monitors if you can get them. The create window, I also usually don't have, because we can usually access this pretty easily if we know the nodes by just pressing tab and typing in tangent fields, right? And just grabbing that and pressing enter. And the property editor I might have open if, for instance, let's see, I'm going to do a layout here. If I have this attribute editor closed, then I'll have that property editor open. But if I have that attribute editor open, I usually just close that because they're effectively the same thing for this purpose, right? And I can do the same thing. I don't have to, I can grab middle mouse click on that node and drop it in here. It doesn't have to be in that property editor. So this is usually how I kind of lay it out, not what you see right here, but just editing this graph editor. If you ever need to get those back, it's browser, property editor, and then it is going to be the create menu. So those are the 3 that are defaulted, and you can just go window. If I want that back, let's grab that create menu, and I can just drag and dock it over here, and then it's good to go. So that should be about it. I hope that made sense.